Our next portion of today's activity is to look for the future. What do we plan for the future? And Michael Penn already mentioned the importance of NLP, and that's how going to help us. And that's the topic of the next section by Slavo. Slavo, it's yours.
Thank you, George. Obligatory question number one. Can everybody hear me? Hello?
Yes.
I can.
Yes, we can.
Good. Thank you. And obligatory question number two. Can everybody see my screen, i.e. the presentation I'm showing?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to all who have spoken before and all who have come and taken part in this conversation. Now, as George already indicated, I will be talking about very briefly what we plan for the future of Simtho, and that mostly involves NLP and essentially NLP for Syriac, since this is the corpus of Syriac. And I will be talking about First, I'll start with what we already have. So the current capabilities of Simtho as a platform that we have is are actually quite strong and quite powerful. And I should spotlight here one fact is that the tool we use, the no-sketch engine, has been provided by a company called Lexical Computing, to whom we owe our thanks for giving us this tool basically free and open source. And it already has a lot of things that you can do, as Michael and James showed us. You can do all kinds of very wonderful things with it, from basic searches to advanced searches to even like using regular expressions, even for those who don't know what they are. George and I developed this tool, Syrian Morph Builder, that can help you with that. There's stuff like filtering and proximity searches that everybody can use to get the most out of Simtho. But in order for Simtho to achieve its full potential, we need more annotation, and that especially concerns linguistic annotation. Now, so far, there have been three versions of Simtho: version 1, version 2, and version 3b, the most current one. And in all of those, we kind of focused on providing both metadata annotation and structural annotation. So as you've seen in the presentation by Michael, we've increased both, especially the structural annotation, and has increased almost twofold since the first version. But until now, we have provided almost no linguistic annotation, except for whatever was already in the text. So this is what is the primary focus of work on the final first version of Simtho. So far, we have been at version 003. Now we're moving to version 1.0. And the linguistic annotation that we're eyeing, at least in this first part, consists of 4 what I will call levels. So the level of lemma, the level of root, which are crucial and essential for improving the search capabilities of Simtho, and then, of course, morphology and part of speech. Now, some of these terms are pretty self-explanatory. Some are not, so I will be briefly discussing them and the challenges associated with them. Number one is the issue of lemma and root. Now, as for root, which is probably the most attractive option for searching in Simtho not yet present, that's a relatively simple issue. I mean, we know what that is. We can usually identify it very well. And that, even if it is very difficult to achieve the identification automatically, this at least is not connected with any sort of conceptual problems. So, we have here a bunch of words that are belong to the same root. So ideally, one of these days, you'll be able to just type "kataba" and find all of them. But we see that these words actually belong to different morphosyntactic categories and also have different morphological information. And this is where trouble begins, because there is a fundamental distinction between a lemma in the computational NLP sense and root. So for root, that's very easy. You have basically just the semantics in the most general sense, and it's easily identifiable. Kataba, katala, whatever you want. With lemma, gets a little more complicated, because in addition to the semantics, you also have morphosyntactic issues to think about. So is this a noun? Is this a verb? Does this behave differently in different contexts? Like adjectives sometimes do. And therefore, sometimes the identification, or rather the decision on how to classify a lemma, can be somewhat difficult, as we've seen in discussions, for example, surrounding Sokoloff's dictionary. This is also intimately associated with the idea of how do we actually lemmatize words, how do we break them down into their individual components so they're useful enough for search, but also not too detailed, perhaps not not detailed enough. So this is an example of actually a hapax legomenon from Simtho, or something like that, to their sensation. It only appears once in Simtho. And we can see here 4 different components. So in green and in orange or brownish. Well, let's start with the orange and brownish. So le, you'll probably identify as a separate lemma. It's one of those 4 short letters that have multiple functions and that traditionally, I think, grammars classify as prepositions. Hon at the end in green, you would probably identify also as something separate from the word. So a different lemma than the fundamental noun. But what about the rest? There are 2 essentially approaches to this. So first, what we could do is we could identify 2 lemmas in this word form. One would be the le, the other one would be the word itself with the suffix, with a possessive suffix, and that possessive suffix we would identify as a morphological property. Another way to go would be to identify 3 lemmas here. You can actually see that properly. We need to move that. So we would have the preposition particle le, we would have the actual word, and then we would have the suffix pronoun. Now, with the second option, the question is, how do we define the lemma for the suffix pronoun? Because here, for example, we cannot assign a root. We could, but like one usually doesn't do that. And then we have also a question of, do we assign a pronoun that already has a plural in it, so the hanon, or do we assign au, the third person singular pronoun, and they just describe it as, this is the lemma is the third person singular pronoun, and there's additional morphological information to that. So this is one of the issues that we're dealing with when trying to figure out what a lemma would be and how to treat morphosyntactic properties of words. The second issue, of course, is what are we going to do with a non-concatenative morphology in Syriac? This is an issue for all Semitic languages, but doubly so for Syriac, since there has been little on this written, except by certain Kiraz guy. I don't know who that is. So again, here we have 2 options. We can treat this word as simply as a noun and forget about the rest. Or we can have some information about its morphology. Then again, the question is how much. So for example, we can include its binyan, its derived stem, in its description, either on the lemma level or on the morphosyntax level. So with issues like this, the important thing is to kind of define properly the levels of annotation and the various fields we use and what fills out those fields. And this brings us to the question of part of speech. So there have been so far 2 attempts to classify or assign part of speech to Syriac words. This is attempt number 1. Again, the same Kiraz guy. I don't know who that is, but he seems to show up a lot in these things. There's been another attempt by the folks from the Grigori Project, who also used their very own system of identifying and assigning labels to words as part of speech. The most interesting part here is at number 12, where they did exactly what I described previously. So basically, they decided to assign morphological information on the binyan, on the derived stem, to this word class. Now, in our future work, we will generally be following the guidelines of the Universal Dependencies Project, because it's a good project, because there's also languages that are similar to Syriac, like Hebrew and Arabic, that have been annotated within the confines of this project, except they use mostly the very reduced universal text set, which you'll see here, basically just adjectives, adverbs, interjections, nouns. and some other things. In Syriac, things are a little more complicated, and we do not want to lose a certain information. So, for example, for where they have particle or adposition, which is prepositions, in our case, we would kind of need to break down these classes because we have words that act in very different ways in very different syntactic environments. So, Dalet, the d particle, is probably the most notorious. It can be complementizer, it can be genitive particle, it can be a conjunction, and so on and so forth. So we have taken this and we are expanding it with classes that are necessary for Syriac, keeping in mind that we can then reduce those as necessary for the requirements of the project. And so we're developing what are called language-specific parts of speech for Syriac. XPOS is the official abbreviation. And so this entire effort has just begun now, and it consists of basically writing down a very detailed description of our decisions for tokenization, lemmatization, assigning rules, assigning morphology, assigning parts of speech. I'm writing an article on this, which hopefully will be out soon. And at the same time, we will write detailed guidelines for the people from Simtho Lab who will actually be annotating these texts. So one of these days, we hope to end up with millions and millions of text annotated like this, with various kinds of levels: word form, root, lemma, part of speech, morphology. As you can see, there's already some issues if you look at it closely, especially item number 3, the existential particle. And how do we get there? Well, the process we have envisioned so far looks like this. We'll start with manual annotation, of which we already have some from Cedra, which will then proceed to a validation step where we hope to unify both of them. We don't know yet how much of the manual annotation we will have, but we're targeting, I think, some 40,000 words, hopefully much more. And then we will use a form of machine learning, depending on what turns out to be best, to annotate all of the rest of the texts automatically. So we'll have a gold corpus consisting of manually annotated text and the full Simtho 1.0 that will have at least the annotation on the level of lemma, part of speech, and morphology. Now, of course, beyond that, there's going to be much more work. So since we started working within the confines of the universal dependencies annotation, we want to continue that as syntactic annotation. We want to proceed with full-scale semantic annotation and linking our data. I think both James and Michael Penn already mentioned them. Something similar along those lines. So we want to do that all across the board. We also want to connect Simtho to Cedra. That, by the way, worked in the previous version. I think the second version with the previous version of No Sketch Engine, where you could basically just click on the word in the concordance and it would take you to Cedra. There's been some difficulties with that, so we're working on improving that. And of course, we're going to be doing a bunch of other language modeling. So as it so happens, I think it's next week at SBL, I will be presenting a paper showing the results of this sort of language modeling. And that is basically it. Exciting times ahead. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Slavo. We all look very much forward to having NLP as part of Simtho.
We hope you enjoyed the Simtho tutorials. Our Simtho Lab team in the Middle East continues manually correcting OCR'd text to give you access to more accurate texts. The Simtho Lab operation is entirely supported by donations, and it provides young men and women in the Middle East with much needed employment during a time of local crisis. Our project also promotes pride in their heritage as workers contribute to promoting their own culture.